So it's 3 p.m. We're ready to start the last, but certainly not the least of the sessions. Uh, Thanks everyone for sticking to the end. We have a very exciting set of lectures, of presentations, not lectures, on autonomous experimentation, and it's going to be followed by a panel as you just saw in the previous session. So our first presenter needs no introductions. Sergei, take it away.
Thank you for introduction, Ali, and it's my pleasure to talk about some ideas and implementation of autonomous discovery with electron and scanning probe microscopy and potentially beyond. So as many of you know, I worked for 20 years in Oak Ridge, then I spent a year in Amazon Moonshot Factory Division. Then I joined the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, almost 2 years to date. And when I joined UT, it was a place which had a pretty rich history of the large-scale, high-throughput materials discovery. So some of my colleagues worked for almost 15 years on the combinatorial growth and the combinatorial laser processing. So once you have the laser processing inside the electron microscope, other of my colleagues work on the high-throughput synthesis with the automated synthesis lab launched in 2019 with the OpenTron, and now having several synthesis robots, including the one that makes films with the PL detection inside the glove box. So once I joined UT, my group started to work on the development of the automated scanning probe microscopy capabilities. So we have an AFM that sends the data to the supercomputer, execute machine learning workflow, and set control signals back to the instrument. We've done the same thing to the Thermo Fisher spectra, so running the similar microscopes and STEM, and started to work on the things like nano-indentation, when we basically teach nano-indenter to do the indentation not over the grid, but in the interesting locations. And we can kind of have a lot of fun with this type of thing. So for example, typically we think about electron microscopes as the way to explore matter, but we can also use it as the device for atomic fabrication. So what you see here is amorphous silicon. This is the crystalline silicon. And as we use the electron beam in order to crystallize a material and create the letter T, essentially one atomic plane at a time. So this is all great. But then we start to realize that the real question is how we make all these things work together. So in other words, imagine that now we have the automated tools. Automated tools is the window for the machine learning to operate in the real world. So how can we make it happen? Well, the problem is that most of the work, sort of 95 to 99%, is basically theory at this point. So this is very well-established field. We typically have funnel type workflows when we start with some large search space, and then we go through the set of progressively more expensive high fidelity filters to create some material candidate. And then theorists say that it's time for experimental validation. Validation usually takes forever, especially if we deal with the biosystems where most of the money is. And also that's not exactly how science works. The key principle of science is to make something experimentally, and then the closed feedback loop based on the theory. That's obviously complicated. In experiment, the field is much more nascent, so it's probably about something like 5 years by now that it has been developing really rapidly. And the workhorse here is the workflows based on the myopic optimization. For example, GP-based Bayesian optimization. We create some parameter space, we run an experiment to synthesize the material, we take a measurement. A key part here is that once we take the measurement, we need to find what is that we care about. For example, it can be position of the peak, it can be the intensity of the peak, but it also can be small peak that indicates the presence of some secondary phase. Then we define what we care about and build the surrogate model that is capable of prediction of the target function and the uncertainty over the whole parameter space. We combine them to make an acquisition function. Acquisition function runs our experiment. So this is a very well established by now paradigm. So the problem is that this is a gross oversimplification of how the real labs work. So imagine that I'm in the lab making the hybrid perovskite. We start with the same reagent. We can use the robots to make microcrystal libraries. We can make thin films. We can grow single crystals. So once we have these materials, we can study them using different methods, cathodoluminescence, optical properties, XPS, make the devices. So ultimately, this type of lab have multiple levels of decision making. And optimization, Bayesian optimization works only on some subtests. Like I can use multi-fidelity methods to use microcrystal library to inform the selection of thin films. But if I want to use the CL data in order to understand how should I change the processing condition, that's not a Bayesian optimization problem. If I want to optimize the selection of the N members based on the time of flight SIMS, for example, that's also not an optimization problem. And it turns out that any lab, even very simple lab, requires multiple levels of decision based on perceived gains, latencies, and costs. And of those latencies and costs, we know that's how our equipment works. But perceived gains is a different story. And then if we look at the bigger picture, we realize that the whole world works like this, right? We can say that we always start with the theory and modeling informed experiment planning. We run experiments in the lab, we make devices, we create products. The problem is that the real economic value is created here, and it's created very slowly. We cannot run optimization experiments here. Fundamental knowledge is created here. So somehow our task is to connect the value back propagating from applications and use the fundamental knowledge for more complex tasks. Then we can ask a question, is machine learning and physics enough to do that? So let me draw this triangle. So let this corner be the data-based method like DCNNs, LLMs, and so on. This corner be physics-based methods, so analytical theory, computational experiment. This, of course, is the continuous range because there are things like structure, GP, and pins that are merging physical and data approaches. So what can be here? And I pose that we actually have a third corner, which is what we want to accomplish. So this is our goal, minimize global warming, make better energy materials, and so on and so forth. So this is the reward. We, of course, have the rewards in data and physics-based methods. So in data-based methods, reward functions are the loss functions, as simple as that. Physics is a little bit more complicated, so we have to deal with the things like predictive power, parsimony, and so on and so forth. But none of this are complex reward functions like this one. So we cannot train the CNN to make a better energy materials. And practically, of course, we have a continuum of reward functions from very simple to very complex ones. Now, you may argue that, okay, so is it something that machine learning folks agree with? And just to quote verbatim from Peter Norvig, who of course knows a lot about machine learning, he says that somewhat remarkably, almost all AI research until very recently has assumed that performance measure, aka utility or reward function, is known. The point that I try to make is that in the real sciences and domain applications, we pretty much almost never know the reward function. We know it only probabilistically. So this being said, okay, that's a way to look at the use of the machine learning in sciences a little bit differently. How can we operationalize it? So let's start with microscopy. Microscopy is usually an operation of the microscope can be represented as the simple workflow. So it's a sequence of operations. And if we want to build this workflow, we can do it in two ways. One is define the policies. So this is our action table, or we can define the reward. So what we want to accomplish, and then policies need to be learned based on the rewards we specify. Reward can be dense, or reward can be sparse and available at the end of the experiment. However, unless we have a reward, if we only have an objective, machine learning just doesn't apply. So we cannot make autonomous microscopies. So we try to build upon this worldview and say that, look, if this is true, that should mean two things. Thing number one, that everything that we have done before has to be explainable in terms of the reward functions. And secondly, it should allow us to do things that we have not been able to do before. So it turns out that both conditions seems to be applied. For example, all the experiments in the automated microscopy and actually human-driven microscopy, if you read the paper, you can clearly identify what the reward functions have the authors used. Image optimization, physics flow discovery, reward functions based on images, structure property relationship discovery, and so on and so forth. So for example, people talk a lot about using machine learning for running autonomous experiments, so doing autonomous science. So generally, there are very few physical laws that can be discovered only in microscope, as opposed to having the combination of synthesis, computation, multiple testing. But some physical laws can be discovered only in the microscope. And one of the things that our group has realized 4 years ago is to build the autonomous scientists that learn the physics of the domain switching without the human intervention. So obviously, this is a very simple form of automated experiment, but automated scientist, but it did work. So obviously, we can run the same type of approaches for more complex scenarios. So for example, we can tell the electron microscope to take the image, send the data to the supercomputer, do the semantic segmentation of the image using SAM, return the segmentically formed information back to the instrument, and then we can tell the instrument to run the measurements like diffraction yields of one particle at a time. That's an example of a very simple reward function, but it's also the example we can easily benchmark the automated workflow compared to human performance. So imagine clicking on each of these particles manually versus having the algorithm do it for you. We were able to show that using the reward-based approach allows us to actually create a new type of the machine learning workflows, which are both explainable and unsupervised. And the way we do it is we define the rewards coming from physics of the system. And then rather than manually tune some analysis functions, we do the tuning as an optimization process in the control parameter space. And of course, we can do it for simple functions like log, or we can do it as the wrapper for the foundational models like SAM. And similar approach works for more complex things. For example, we can run the IFM as the automated discovery platform, so we can study the combinatorial libraries. In this case, we have to build the multi-component workflows because we need to look at the optical data flow, we need to tune the instrument, and then we need to tell the instrument how to move along our combinatorial library. But it works, so this looks like a snapshot of the classical Gaussian process, but in fact, it is the experimental data plans. So, and then there are a lot of other fun things we can do. So for example, mapping structure property relations in the optimal way, do the automated tuning, or even run some very similar simple experiments when we just scan the surface and identify the interesting objects and take the specific measurements on top of those. So why the reward-based approach matters? It matters because it defines a slightly different paradigm for interaction between the human and the tools. So for example, we spent some time building the myopic deep kernel learning-based workflows for running the instrument. And in this case, this workflow can be run very, very rapidly. What the human can do is to intervene on the level of the reward definition, so what physics you're interested in, and the level of policy, how you want to balance exploration, exploitation. And this is the example of how it is done. So this is obviously a recording, but it's a recording of machine learning agent interacting with the live instrument. So basically, in this case, we run the workflow, human monitors what goes on. So we define the initial experimental parameters. Our tools are designed for the time being for the human monitoring. So we can get some ideas whether the experiment goes in the right direction or not. And then we can intervene on the policy, for example, tell the instrument to look for slightly different aspects of material behavior, and then it will find the slightly different locations. So the transition that we have see now is that this is classically how classical research tools work. Human looks on the screen on the imaging and spectral data, and human makes decision, then executes the commands. So this is what we built now. We have the machine learning agent that has access to the imaging and spectral data and can execute the primitive commands. And the role of the human is monitor the machine learning agent and intervene on the level of rewards or policies. So the value proposition here is that electron microscopes are much faster than humans. So the electron microscope can perform hundreds of operations in the time scale of the human reaction. Even though when I look at my kids playing Smash Bros. Or Doom, maybe it's not 3 orders of magnitude, maybe it's 2.5. So, and I think that this is the point when the autonomous instrumentation start to integrate with the work done with the large language models and other ways, because this is connection happens through the level of the reward functions. So they can come from human, or they can come from the LLM interacting with human. So it turns out, obviously don't have time to talk about it, but once we define the rewards, we can, in a native way, run more complex experiments. For example, we can use a single ML agent to orchestrate several characterization tools at the same time, and we can benchmark what is the auxiliary advantage. We can start to build the theory in the loop when our machine learning agent runs the simulation, expensive experiment. And I think that a very important point here is that big data and infrastructure are super useful and sometimes is sufficient. And it is sufficient in the field with plenty of downstream application and plenty of data. But automated discovery is going where no one has gone before. So we cannot do it based on data because we don't have data by definition. But with the reward functions, we can start to move there. And a very interesting thing is that for the time being, I've shown you the examples of single human interacting with a single ML agent. But if there are multiple humans and multiple agents, and we summarize how it will going to look like, so what should be the rules of the game, I think that the future of the automated experiment is basically the giant multiple role-playing game. So all the basic elements are in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergei, for a terrific presentation. In the interest of time, if you have questions for Sergei, keep them for the panel so we stay a little bit on time. The next presentation is going to be a tag team presentation by folks from CMU. So we have Kevin Noonan. He's the professor and associate head of chemistry at CMU, and Newell Washburn. He's an associate professor of chemistry. Newell is interested in the intersection of materials chemistry and sustainability. And Kevin is interested in polymer chemistry and catalysis, but they're both involved with the cloud lab at CMU. So I'm looking forward to hearing what they want to share with us. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. We appreciate the opportunity to speak. So I'm going to cover the first half, and Kevin will do the second half. So let me just launch in, assuming everyone can see the screen. So this is a photo of the cloud lab. This is in Pittsburgh. It's actually off the main campus, but probably less than 2 miles from where I'm sitting. It opened this spring. So it's a remote controlled laboratory, primarily dedicated to chemistry and biology research. It has over 130 instruments, doing everything ranging from sort of synthesis, cell culture, et cetera, to a number of different characterization techniques. Everything in the cloud lab has some level of automation. And so, like, for example, the kind of chemical stock room or storeroom is everything has got a barcode. You actually, the system actually needs to know the size of every container, like solvent container, or every container of reagent, and then those are called automatically and dispensed into the experiments. They're human operators that kind of help move things along, but it's based on a model that there's a company called Emerald Cloud Lab, or ECL, that was actually founded by two guys who are CMU undergraduates. They recently moved to Texas. They have a facility that I think is 125,000 square feet, so it's Texas sized. They primarily have focused on they do a lot of work with pharmaceutical companies. We have much broader interest than just doing kind of drug discovery. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but basically, multi-step experiments get programmed, and Kevin's going to give some examples of kind of how you do the individual steps. But the idea is that, that your samples will move through the cloud lab, and all these activities are coordinated by an operating system. And so the lab is designed, it runs 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And you can run your experiments from anywhere in the world. The benefits, I mean, obviously this is an exciting vision. There's a real, lot of interest that we're getting in terms of how can we, really, just not just increase productivity, but really start to tackle questions and do research in a way that we really haven't done before. And I'll just point to, we're, being CMU, we're of course, deeply involved in thinking about the data too, and I enjoyed the previous session on just discussing sort of how we make the data most as useful as possible. So the project that my group just recently finished, and so I'm going to talk about one demonstration project. Kevin will talk about another. So it involves Covestro. So Covestro is a German company. They used to be part of Bayer Chemical. They're one of the largest producers of polyurethanes and polycarbonates in the world. They sell $15 billion a year of both those materials. On the polyurethane side, these are practically ubiquitous engineering polymer, and they get used all over the place in foams, coatings, elastomers, et cetera. You make a polyurethane through reacting a polyisocyanate with a polyol. And you get sort of this, at a microstructural level, you get this kind of microphase separation. And it turns out that the compatibility between the polyol and the polyisocyanate is the thermodynamic compatibility is actually really important for assessing the kind of strength of the segregation that occurs in the microstructure. And then you can start to make all sorts of predictions about the resulting mechanical properties once you know that. So a very old technique that still provides really useful insight is measuring what's called the Hansen solubility parameter. And so it essentially looks at intermolecular interaction by representing three forces, so like hydrogen bonding forces, dipolar forces, and dispersion forces. And so you can estimate things like solubility and miscibility by measuring the three components by basically mapping the properties onto this three-dimensional space. We can now actually calculate these very accurately for small molecules, but for oligomers and polymers, we still can't do accurate calculations for molecules that big. And so we still, companies like Covestro still resort to having to measure these. And so the project that we did was basically seeing if we could use the cloud lab as it was just in the process of opening to start to run these experiments. And so the way you actually do the experiment in practice is very simple. You take, the polyols were mostly liquids that we were looking at. And so you take 5 milliliters of polyol and 5 milliliters of a solvent, you shake it up, and then you just look to see, is it one phase or two phases? As you start to really map out, with using solvents with known characteristics, you can start to map out where you are in this space. And so it's just a question of doing enough of these experiments to get an estimate. And so just to show kind of how we approach this, we developed an active learning approach, so in the cloud lab. And so some of this happens outside the cloud lab and some happens inside the cloud lab, but essentially you start at designing the experiment, we set that up in our lab, but then we, through some of the command line architectures that we use in running the lab, you can execute the experiments. These wind up being relatively simple. So it's basically selecting solvents and materials, dispensing, mixing, and imaging, and then that tells you where you are in the space. And then the active learning piece just determines, sort of how, essentially how you keep going through until you, in this case, until you reach your objective, which is maximizing the accuracy of your knowledge of the Hansen's solubility parameter of the new material you're testing, which is assumed to be in the center of a sphere that governs the decision boundary between immiscible and admissible. So that was the piece that I was involved in, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kevin, and he's going to talk about some work that he's done related to his own research.
Yeah, so just to kind of highlight, Newell's talking about one of the problems or one of the challenges that they were sort of dealing with. And my group's been very interested in, as I mentioned, catalysis, organic synthesis as it relates to making conjugated materials, which are basically polyaromatics. So defined by a system of single and double bonds, like all of the polymers and cycles you see here. We're very interested in these for a variety of different applications, which can range from being sensing, solar cells, light emitters, though I would say specifically my group is really interested in how to make these and how to make them in a precise and really well-defined way. We were drawn to the cloud lab because of the idea of kind of push button reproducibility. Could we take something where we can kind of develop a protocol that we could kind of redo over and over again? One of the big challenges with a new student who's doing a new project or a project that you've done before is that maybe that synthesis doesn't work the same every time. Organic chemistry often has, I would say, this big challenge. And so we were trying to develop a very simple reaction scheme. We want to develop it towards polymers, but we very much started with small molecules. And so this is called an oxidative coupling reaction, where I'm basically taking a thiophene unit and I'm trying to basically make a new carbon-carbon bond in this. One of the things I love about the Cloud Lab system is that every time you put a new sample in the Cloud Lab, you get this knowledge graph. So basically, anytime your sample moves within the laboratory, there's documentation. There's documentation, pressure, temperature, humidity, everything is kind of documented in that lab space. And you have access to that every time your things have essentially moved. Anytime there's something pulled out of a vial or a vessel, you are aware of each of those different interactions. And so I think that that's one of the beauties and benefits of utilizing this kind of system. So we were trying to develop this chemistry, and this is kind of what you're looking at there are basically the tables that you would see as you sort of work through one of the notebooks in this kind of lab setup, and scheme. You can also collect analytical data. They have, I think, nearly 200 instruments that are basically connected. So you can write simple coded protocols to collect, and all of this information is all collected within the same notebook. And then you can do assignments if you'd like. Almost all of this is kind of defined. So let's see. Yeah. So this is basically the molecule that I'm looking at. And then you write coded protocols to basically do this assignment. This also remains for all of the future users. So one of the things that we're talking about in the data, I guess, portion in the previous part of the session was how important, data is. We want to make all of this kind of broadly available to any other user that would want to do this type of experiment, for example. And so the idea is we can kind of do all of our assignments and then everybody has access to that. So then you actually go to the execution of the experiment. When I take all of my materials, I would kind of combine them, and then I essentially write a coded protocol in this case to, let's see if I can put that to come up. Yeah, would be a coded protocol that actually executes this experiment. And if you're familiar with experimental setups that are in organic chemistry, this is a lot more detailed. And the Cloud Lab uses what they call symbolic lab language. So the idea is that basically you can read this coded protocol. I'm going to take this thing, I'm going to put in this number, this amount, this reagent, we're going to stir for this long, and you kind of go through this. So you can literally read this protocol, but now it's kind of in a machine readable format rather than experimentals like you would see. And then of course you can collect analytical data to see whether or not your experiment actually worked. In this case, we actually can see, so on the top spectrum, what you're looking at is the starting material, and on the bottom spectrum is actually a crude NMR of my reaction mixture where I've looked at basically this, and I can see these new signals which are emerging for the product. I also get pictures of each of my different reactions, and so you're seeing actually over here the picture of the reaction. And I know usually when these reactions work well, there's color associated with it. So it starts off as a clear solution, and normally it progresses either to yellow or all the way to black in some cases, and that's usually a good sign that the reaction is actually proceeding. So this is our way kind of to sort of map using this kind of remote controlled facility, we can actually start to run chemical reactions. Okay, and so for the conclusions, I'll just turn back to Newell, but I will say that I do see this as like we are building, and we can really start to build from all of the codes that we have so far. Go ahead, Newell.
Yeah, so I mean, just to close up, I mean, obviously, we're excited about the potential for increasing research throughput. And we can actually close the loop by combining automation with active learning. Most users report some surprises in terms of sort of how complex doing certain tasks that would be simple to do in your own lab can be. And so really the answer to that is that we're still, CMU is very focused on really advancing the laboratory instrumentation and the control systems in order to really fully realize this vision. And so Kevin and I had hoped to stick around for the panel. CMU is announced, or we have an all hands meeting in a little while, where we think they're probably going to be announcing some significant changes in terms of how the lab is actually being run and the involvement of ECL in it. So unfortunately, we're gonna miss that panel discussion, but we'd be happy to join the next meeting and give you the next update.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Newell and Kevin. We are running a little late, but we have the panel. So let me ask you a question, given that you won't be able to stay for the panel, and then we'll set up the last talk. With your experience with the Cloud Lab, what are the experiments that are hard or that we shouldn't automate? What are the things that are not amenable to automation or you wouldn't recommend automating? Or should everything be automated eventually?
Yes. So I'll be at the beach. I mean, I don't know, Kevin, I think you've got a good perspective on this, just because like if you're really thinking about like if you're trying to like automating Hansen solubility parameters is a no-brainer. We should absolutely do that. But I mean, Kevin, I think has got a really good perspective on just how, like, if you're doing one step in a chemical reaction, like you're trying to make something, like you've got all these diverging paths as you go along trying toward the goal of making a product. And I don't know, Kevin, is that something that you think we can really automate? Because it just, the space that you need to cover really gets quite large.
It's a great description. Basically, the complexity kind of like spiders out because, one of the things we've learned with Emerald is that Emerald drops everything into like a small bucket. So if I'm mixing everything together, that's what they call protocol. But for me to run a reaction to go from like A to B and purified B to get to purified B might be anywhere from 10 to 15 protocols within the facility. So it adds a huge amount of complexity. If I have to purify, do I have to do X? Do I need dry reagents? All those things that Newell's basically just kind of noted. That being said, I think that there is opportunities for us to do and think about it in all of these spaces. And I think the key question is like, what's the science that's going to drive, like, how can automation help me make the answers that I get faster? That's where I think we have to think about where it makes sense to put a human in and not always. I don't know if I have the perfect answer for you. It's a really good question. I'm going to try to automate everything and then we'll work backwards and take them back out where we can't use it properly.
Yeah, that sounds great. All right, well, thank you very much. Our next presenter, thank you, is Jaafar El-Awady. Comes from Johns Hopkins. He's the director of the Integrated Computations and Experiments for Intelligent Materials Design Laboratory and the Automated Materials Design for Extreme Environments Center. So Jaafar, take it away.
Thank you very much for inviting me to present today. So I'm going to present today a miles-high overview of some of the activities that we're that are going on at Hopkins in terms of automated materials design for extreme environment, and particularly focused on structural materials. This is a huge effort by about 11 co-PIs and many, many students, postdocs, and research staff. The picture that I'm showing on the left over here is, I think, maybe about a third of the group. And it's just almost impossible to get all the people involved in at the same time to take one major picture. So what I'm going to present today is our efforts on that direction of if I can get this to move, on automated materials discovery. So the framework for materials design and discovery, not going to spend any much time on it. We all understand machine learning and AI can help us in expediting the process of optimizing materials and discovering new materials for with superior properties that we're interested in. However, the point that a lot of times gets missed is that we really need a lot of data, and these simulations, these multi-scale models that tend to do a lot of unique physics-based understanding of materials and predictions, and these multi-scale experiments tend to be very, very time-consuming. And if we really want to do this properly, we really need high quality and high throughput data. So this is really the gist of what we're trying to build at Hopkins with this with this presentation. So about 2 years ago, we started this project related to automated materials design for extreme environments. The idea is that we wanted to advance the process of structural materials design in extreme environments. And the way that we thought about it is accelerating the process through high throughput data generation and multiple subsystems that are all co-located and co-integrated within a central robotic automation framework, as well as an infrastructure for data and computing to enable ultimately AI decision making and full closed loop design of and discovery of materials. The current focus of our activities have been predominantly metals, metallic alloys, although the lab is as well have been enabling some research activities on ceramics and discovery in ceramics, again, for high strain rate and high temperature environments. So we've really had the keys to the lab about 1.5 years ago, and in the last 1.5 years been trying to integrate all these different components that I'm showing you over here. I'm going to show you that in a little bit more details on the next slide. So this is the lab itself. This is the AI Materials Design Laboratory at Johns Hopkins University. We have multiple stations. The only thing here that is not part of the lab is the processing aspect, so the thick foil sputtering that is outside of the lab. However, the lab itself has a substation focused on laser engraving and flyer cutting. The flyers relate to the laser shock, which is at the end of the image on the right. We have a profilometer, I can never pronounce that word properly, profilometry system that enables us to do surface roughnesses, nano indentation, can do mapping of strengths, XRD and XRF, again, to be able to quantify microstructure, chemistry, and so on and so forth, and laser shock to quantify dynamic fracture, spall strength, and so on and so forth. So the goal, again, is structural materials and be able to explore them with high throughput. So to be able to handle materials in a high throughput fashion, we came up with a design for a sample holder that you're seeing on the bottom over here. The dark gray represents the sample holder. The shiny gray is actually our thick foils that I'll talk about in a minute. But the idea is that we really needed a way that we can handle the samples. It can go between stations. And in addition, as it goes between stations and different tests and different analyses are done at every station, that the data that is being generated all ultimately come together in a correct framework. So this is where the laser engraving is. All the samples that come in, you can actually see the sample itself has a QR code as well as the sample holder, that every time the sample goes to a different substation, we actually are tracking the data that is generated by that substation and correlating it directly to the actual sample and the material. So I'm going to walk you through some of the aspects of the automation that we've already accomplished. So the first thing that we need to focus on, that we've focused on as well, is the arms and legs of the lab. This is a fully automated lab. The idea is that we wanted to take the human out of the loop. as much as possible. One of the things that a lot of times is missed in discussions about uncertainties in experiments is the uncertainties in the person that is actually running the experiment. So the idea of removing people out of the loop and creating a fully automated lab, it can enable us to achieve the repeatability. So the arms and legs here are basically a conveyor belt that acts as our two-way freeway that moves samples between different stations. Each station or substation has its own sample hold station. Again, samples can be parked there for a while until they're called upon by the AI system, or when their turn comes in to be manipulated within that substation. And then things are moving around between the instruments and the conveyor belt and the sample hold station through these 6 degrees of freedom robots that are equipped with vacuum gripper. As you can see in the image on the top over here, you can see our sample holder being gripped by the vacuum gripper. And in addition, attached to it, there is a camera that, again, always scans the QR code. And thus, we know where each sample is, and we know the data that is associated as it's being generated, where to associate that data with. So this is, again, the arms and the legs of the lab. And then as we move around the conveyor belt, there are different stations. The first station that we were thinking about was related to how do we characterize the material. So again, this is the sample holder, top view of it, showing you the actual sample on top over there. These typically are thick foils that can range from tens of microns to millimeter scales, depending on what we're trying to explore. And they can be generated through thick foil deposition or through additive manufacturing. We're actually working with both. But the neat thing with this is that you can create these gradients of chemistries and microstructures across the sample itself, and thus every point on your sample becomes a separate experiment. If you can do the experiment at that specific scale, then you're going to be able to do a large set of experiments per sample at a time. But to be able to correlate whatever mechanical properties that we're going to generate, we need an efficient and a fast way of generating microstructural information. We need to identify the phases. We need to identify grain size distributions. We need to identify texture, chemical compositions, and so on and so forth. Yes, you can do high fidelity microscopy type of studies, SEM, TEM, but these are very time-consuming processes or techniques that require a lot of sample preparation. However, if you really the goal is the high throughput and the rapid identification of differences in microstructures from point to point, we think that X-ray diffraction and X-ray fluorescence would serve that goal quite effectively. So we've actually incorporated on the Belt a Maxima machine, which is a multimodal automated X-ray investigation of materials. That's the name of it. But it's fully automated. What we're showing you here is actually how the robots move samples from the trays into the X-ray machine. This is one of my understanding, I'm not an X-ray expert, but my understanding this is one of the strongest sources, X-ray sources that you can have outside of a national lab in this machine. So the samples go in, you can see inside views of the sample holding, managing the sample as when moving it in front of the X-ray source, and thus ultimately being able to image. Now, all these doors would close definitely during the X-ray imaging, but we're showing you here just how things operate. And then ultimately the sample can move out, and then it can go through the rest of the characterization that we're interested in. So moving along, so one of the other substations that we have, the two major mechanical testing substations that we currently have installed in the lab, is a nano-indentation stage. Nano-indentation is very classical. People know that you can do high throughput measurements on samples, on individual samples. Now, the difference here again is that we're trying to have everything automated. So the robots are moving the samples into the nano-indenter, and then the nano-indentation is happening, and then you can remove the sample afterwards. So we had to redesign the sample tray to and have it more of a vacuum sample tray in a way that we can grip the specimen when it's loaded by the X-ray, by the robots, I'm sorry. But ultimately, then you're generating all your hardness maps and the data associated with that is all, again, correlated to the sample itself, because, again, QR codes here allow us to connect the data to the sample. So now you actually have point-wise measurements from the X-rays of the microstructure and the chemistry that you can directly correlate with the nanoindentation measurements that are happening here. I should emphasize, because what we're trying to build here is not just an operation in terms of experimental facilities connected to each other, but we're overlaying this as well with physics-based models and data-driven models that are both learning from the physics-based models as a low-fidelity framework, but then utilizing the data that is being generated to not just validate the physics-based models, but to improve them and make them actually more efficient. So we've implemented a multi-fidelity framework for both phase prediction as well as for strength predictions that are informed by the data as they're coming in from the experiments, improved, and the accuracy and the speed of our predictions for the next batch actually gets improved and expedited. So again, I'm not going to go through the details of the models themselves, but these are overlaid on each one of these subsystems that we have. So there are specific models for each one of these subsystems for the material predictions. Now, moving on to the dynamic strength, dynamic fracture, and high strain rate deformation, we decided to do this through what is known as laser shock experiments. Laser shock experiments, the idea with it is that you're hitting a laser on a foil, this foil that you can see in orange here on the top left. That foil basically has pre-etched circular grooves in it. When the laser comes and hits right behind one of these grooves, again, it's basically on a glass plate. When the laser comes through the glass plate, hits the copper foil, ultimately that creates a stress wave that propagates through the material, ultimately creates the stresses would be high enough for that pre-cut to actually fracture, and now you have a flyer that you're seeing flying over there that ultimately hits the specimen that you have. So we have to actually assemble all of that on top of our specimens, and that's what we're showing on the top image here. That assembly is as well fully automated now that we can actually put in the samples, comes in with the robotics, assemble the flyers on top, and then you can do the lasers and you shoot them. And the image that we're showing you on the right here is showing that automated process where through computer vision, you can actually identify where these specific flyers are. Thus, you can make the decision to shoot. You move the sample, and then you shoot. And then now you have the flyer that hits your sample. And then as the movie continues, you'll start seeing, let me speed it up here. Right, actually, oops, sorry. You can actually see the laser hitting. In this case, you'll see a pop forming on top of that layer. That's basically where the microflyer was initiated and propagated and hit the material. Now, this is a very efficient approach to do these experiments, these types of high strain rate experiments in the range of 10 to the 6, 10 to the 8. And you can get a lot of data. And what we're showing you here is just a subset of data that was actually generated manually with this laser setup, not with the fully automated case. But the neat thing with the setup of laser shock microflyer impact is that the amount of data that you can generate, even by a human sitting there and doing it, is hundreds of data points within a week. With the automation, our estimates right now is that you can actually do thousands of data points per day. So the amount of data that can be generated is significant, and the amount of data that or the properties that you're measuring. So although that I'm showing you a TEM image here and an EBSD mapping, this is not part of what we're extracting from the lab. But from the laser setup itself, through the measurements of the back surface velocity and such, you can actually quantify the Hugonius elastic limit, the equation of state, shock stresses, shock speed, shock spall, and you can vary basically the shock pressure, you can vary the strain rates and get significant amount of variations and explore these specific properties, as well as explore the microstructural influences and explore the chemistry influences on the spall strength. So it's a quite unique case. And what I'm showing you here is an example of niobium. And if you look through the literature of niobium of spall strength versus shock pressure over the last 40 years, there's a handful of data points. Within a matter of month, this is KT Ramesh's group, they've been able to generate hundreds of data points for that same material. And now, as we're saying, as we're building this in a more autonomous way, we think that we can actually generate more on the level of thousands per day, thousands of data points per day. Again, this is engulfed with a AI-driven framework to predict the influence of potential microstructures and chemistries. And again, these are physics-based models that have trained machine learning methods to predict, again, the spall strength, to predict the influence of the microstructures. And again, these models are thousands of times or orders of magnitudes faster than classical multi-scale materials models now. To wrap things up, data and storage and data management is a very key aspect of this project. So really, data is basically your thread that creates that bidirectional connection between all the autonomous and control systems and your scientific and AI processes. Thus, we really need to consider these workflows that produce, analyze, and curate data. And within AIMD, we do link these workflows through a live streaming with OpenMSI. And just to give you an example of how we're doing this, so this is actually something that an example of the laser shock substation itself. Where in one, basically, as you're running your experiment, you're generating your stream of data. So the stream of data is generated autonomously within that experiment. Goes to step number 2, where you have the processors autonomously extracting all the metadata, and curating the data and putting them basically into our data platform, and ultimately moving that to step 3, where our ALPS processing system process the actual data as it comes in, so you can actually return experimental analysis. That experimental analysis and outcomes can actually feed into the computational models and help validate and improve them, and ultimately create the AI decisions that are going to be needed for the next batch of tests. So this is where we are right now. We haven't really connected that loop, or we're still working on the connection of the loop of the AI decision. We've been focusing over the last year and a half on the automation aspect and the connection between the models and the experimental data. But we're almost there, and we're shooting for a grand opening of the lab where we would have the full loop closed loop AI decision making within the lab by the end of spring, or before the beginning of the summer. So we're continuously to iterate right now and improve on the AI integration and demonstrate large-scale workflows over extended time, so extended days. We want to see that the lab runs for days. And ultimately, the next goal after we accomplish this is to really go from automation to full autonomy. And we're hopeful that we will be there by the end of the year. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaafar. So now it's time for our last panel of the day and of MaRDA 2025. So I'm going to ask Sergei and Corinne to join us. If someone could pin them, that'd be terrific. So we've already introduced Sergei and Jaafar. Let me, thank you. So we're all in. Let me introduce Corinne Lipscomb. She is the R&D Director of Product Informatics and Modeling Group at Solventum. This is a recent spin-off of 3M Healthcare business. And she leads a team, an integrated group, and they combine simulation, AI, analysis, data, so quite a range of activities. And so we had 3 presentations on autonomous experimentation from academic groups. So maybe I can put you on the spot, Corinne, and ask you, how do you see the field with an industrial perspective?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I do think it's a little different. So someone in the first panel referenced, how nice it is to have new labs every decade or so. It's even longer than that in industry. So some of the challenges, even to the kinds of things we've heard some of the other folks talk about in terms of instrument connectivity and things like that. I'm thrilled to say, as a spin out, we're getting an entirely new lab next year. So we can have a hand in designing the IT infrastructure that can support, you know, better connectivity of data, driving better data management as the foundation for being able to do more of these things. But we're still very much in the automation kind of form, and really looking at kind of priority order in terms of where's the most standardized testing, right? Where is the robotics and the capital associated with that automation really worth it to get started and to kind of prove that point to the industry more broadly and ourselves. So we start with our analytical laboratory, which obviously has all of the, you know, multi-million-dollar tools that all of our businesses share. So we're doing a lot of work, kind of some of it perhaps akin to Sergei's in microscopy for our own materials to make sure we can be as efficient as possible. We're also looking to, you know, better understand, because we're a healthcare company, what we can do in terms of data processing that feeds other parts of our system where we must do documentation in a far more rigorous way than, for example, some of the material science sectors or other industrial firms.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. And so maybe just a quick follow-up. By the way, I'm going to encourage everyone, write your questions in the chat. And of course, you'll be able to just unmute yourself and ask questions in a minute. So as you design your next lab, how do you balance the automation versus the same question I asked to Newell and Kevin, and things that you shouldn't or you can't automate?
Yeah. So certainly we focus on the things where we have high confidence first. There's a lot of mechanical testing where I think we have pretty high confidence that we can be successful in automating those test methods. You know, one of the things, this was true at 3M as well as now Solventum, that we have challenges automating is really working with high viscous materials or sticky stuff, right? So, you know, we're well known for these kinds of things, and we simply have a hard time getting the robots to work. So, you know, we have looked in the past at kind of even some formulation automation. It's a bit restricting for our purposes, what's available today. We hope some of that changes, but that's probably our most challenging area for the automation. But certainly any place where kind of expert sample prep is required also becomes difficult.
So another aspect that I find fascinating is, and maybe I would imagine that there's different answers for the different areas here, but how do you balance high throughput, well, you know, let's say automated or autonomous, high throughput versus high fidelity, right? So Jaafar was showing these, you know, laser flyer plate experiments that actually are getting very accurate, but not necessarily gold standard. Maybe KT would disagree, but they're not the gold standard for a shock. So how do you balance those two things?
The nice thing with the laser shock, even that if you're saying they're not the gold standard, yes, there are challenges associated with it. But the nice thing with being able to do thousands of experiments, if some of them are bad, you can identify which ones are bad and throw them away easier than if you're doing some of these plate impact studies that take a lot of time to set up, and you're getting a one experiment per day if you have experts that are running it, right? So that's the difference in terms of high throughput. You can do a lot, right? And you can, from that a lot, identify the bad data, throw it away, and keep the good data. That's one aspect of it, if you want to think of it that way. And the low fidelity, or the low throughput, high fidelity experiments then can be identified from that data set that you're generating at a high throughput, low fidelity stream. And that's our vision as well in terms of, if you think of the material models are always going to be low fidelity compared to experiments, but they can provide you with a quick screening, even quicker than what you're going to be doing with the high throughput experiments. So integrating all that together hopefully will allow you to ultimately zoom in on a subset of materials that you can do the high fidelity, low volume type of experiments on.
Yeah,
Was
is that
also
something you encounter, Sergey? Yes.
Yeah, so I would like to kind of chime in on that. So our experience both with the toy models and some relatively simple materials discovery pipelines. So when we use the photovoltage on the AFM as the screening signal and making the device as the high fidelity type of experiment, suggests a very interesting pattern that our workhorse here is the multi-fidelity methods when we assume that there is some correlative link between low and high fidelity data. So in the beginning of your screening, it's very helpful. It tries to accelerate the discovery of the high fidelity regions of interest. But once you are well into your experiment, the low fidelity data start to throw you off, and you have a kind of subtle effect when a lot of low fidelity data actually stops precluding the high fidelity experiments to get to the right optimum. And then the part of the solution can be switching from the data-informed methods to the physics-informed methods when we, for example, add the structural mean function for the Gaussian process that reflects the physics of the system. So practically, it turns out that the package solutions, when we just use the correlation, are usually not sufficient. So we need to somehow develop policies that balance the data-informed decisions, physics-informed decisions. And once we start to have more than two observables, we actually need to realize that the correlative links does not have to be symmetric. So sometimes things factor 1 affects factor 2, but not vice versa. So then we need to think about building the causal representation for the fidelity kernels and the Gaussian processes. So there are a lot of interesting things can be done there, and ultimately they are exceptionally experiment oriented.
Good opportunities for ML and AI, right, to bridge the gap between the low fidelity and high fidelity, and bringing in models and simulations at the same time.
I'm not sure what the way forward here would be, because you see both experiment and model come with a different set of uncertainties. So we can either completely trust the theory, or we can trust theory much more than experiment. Then theory, if the theory is fast, we have our low fidelity proxy. We can completely trust the experiment and then choose what we choose to model. But in general, both of them come with the epistemic uncertainty. So the theory and experiment are mismatched. When our data is not terribly good, the epistemic uncertainty doesn't matter. When our data becomes high quality, then we have a systematic discrepancy between the model and experiment. And learning to operate in those environments, that would be one of the next challenges for the automated labs, because in the human-driven research, we kind of deal with this type of problems on the intuitive level, and we never compare. In the automated labs, that will become an issue number one after the first half year of data generation.
Yeah, and that's where Bayesian approaches come in handy, and being able to account for the uncertainties, both noise and epistemic. And so David kindly reminded me to have people go to the Google Doc to ask questions. But we're talking about data and data acquisition. I am incapable of listening to the conversations and read the document at the same time. So I'm going to count on someone else to read the document, maybe David.
I can do that.
Convey some of the key questions, or just unmute yourself, raise your hand, and ask your question, which would be better. So let me ask about the next the follow-up question about your workforce development and education. So Corinne is a consumer of what we as academicians produce, right? She hires our product. What are the skills that we need to start teaching our students and the current workforce to be able to work in this environment where AI is becoming more prevalent, and autonomous experimentation also is becoming more prevalent? How do we rethink? We had a little bit of that conversation before. what we teach our students, what are the skills that they're going to need 5 years down the line, and how do we adjust our courses accordingly?
Yeah, so first I'll say finding talented new students in our space is not our biggest problem. Actually, teaching a highly educated scientific and engineering workforce that doesn't understand digital, what we're capable of, is our hardest problem on that front. So we spend more time than I think most groups would recognize on internal education, right? Walking other subject matter experts who sometimes know the products better than we do, but who don't necessarily have the technology that we do to help them solve problems, and forming partnerships. So I always say kind of the kinds of skill sets you guys were mentioning earlier in your workforce training, these are table stakes for kind of interviews on a team like ours. What gets you the job is your ability to explain those advanced technologies, to explain what application you were actually using the technology to solve, right? We are exceptionally use case focused. What is the first problem we can solve, and what is the simplest way we can solve it? And then once we've got that done, we can build on that with solving bigger problems that require more complex solutions. So that ability to communicate how the complex technology to folks who are well educated in science and engineering but don't understand the technology is ultimately the thing that kind of makes or breaks most of our hiring.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jaafar, Sergei, anything to add?
And in my experience, the big game changer was obviously the ChatGPT and the coding assistants. So before then, if we want to teach people machine learning, it just has to come with the serious Python prerequisites, or you have to spend a lot of time teaching Python. There is no way around that. So practically at this point, if I teach students, I know basically I can tell them that look up to solid level, you would be able to use ML for the real world problems, even without knowledge Python. You will pay for it down the stream. You will still need to learn it, but not in the beginning. And then the focus of the education becomes hands-on practice, solving using ML, how to solve problems. So the difficulty and new opportunity here is that not only we can use machine learning to solve problems that we already know, but also machine learning has a broad set of concepts that are typically not used as the part of physics or material science and so on. So everything that relates to the latent representation, that's not a physics community. So everything that relates to the decision-making theory, I mean, here the problem is that there are, according to Warren Powell, there are 16 different schools of thought for the decision-making theory, all of which have a slightly different language. And being able to communicate to students how to learn to use them is possible only by emphasizing the hands-on practice first, and then basically saying that, look, there is a big difference how we approach problems. So the classical ML field usually focuses on one specific area and you become an expert in one domain. If you want to be a domain user of machine learning, you have to have a collection of the tools in your toolbox, and you need to choose the simplest tool that can still solve the problem and matches the physics of what's going on. So for example, if you analyze the cathodoluminescence spectra, you should never use the variational autoencoders because the data generation process is linear. And basically, this constant moving between the physics to ML and back to the physics, that's how you develop the intuition and the learning capabilities. And now we can do it pretty fast on the initial levels. How this will affect the development of workforce from in kind of initial, the mid-skill level to the advanced skill level, that I don't know. I suspect that this is where the ChatGPT can become a hindrance rather than accelerating factor. But I guess there was already the Isaac Asimov story about profession, about 50s, about what will happen if we can just directly download skills in the human brain. So we are living at the time when it actually is happening.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting in this emerging field to think about what are the fundamentals, right? We always said, I think the answer with education is that you're in college to learn the fundamentals, and those skills are going to be applicable when you go to the workforce, regardless of what you end up doing. And I think in some of these areas, those fundamentals, like you were saying, okay, you're a domain expert, you know the physics is linear, don't use a nonlinear analysis, right? Because you're going to waste time. Those, you don't need to know Python, you don't need to be a super expert on AI. You just need to have that fundamental understanding of the domain problem and your tools, right? And I think
Yep.
that is still under development to a large degree, right? Where the problem and the tools are not necessarily matched in a lot of the papers that you see published.
Ollie, we
One
have
thing I
two
chime in
people up
here
with
very quickly is that the key thing is now no longer for us to understand our problem, but understand the problem of the people who are upstream or downstream from us. So this is where the emphasis shifts.
Definitely. Yeah. So David, you were saying?
Yeah, there are people with hands up. So Jake and Keo both have.
Yeah, I can see it now. I had a bar blocking all of that. Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, so my question is that as these sort of autonomous setups transition from working in an individual laboratory to being something closer to a user facility, how you think about ensuring safety protocols and ensuring that people don't just completely, even without their knowledge, end up mixing incompatible chemicals or have sort of thermal runaway problems or things that wouldn't happen if you were one graduate student dealing with your own bench. Whereas, if you're 50 miles away on a laptop and you're saying, oh, let's do it, but you don't know where that waste stream is going and what it might mix in with, how do we think about, directing traffic that way in that transition?
Great question.
So with a lot of this might more relate to the other talk that the speakers are not here for. But
Yeah,
within AIMD as an example, most of the materials are done outside of the lab, and then they come into the lab for the full cycle. So some of these issues then become mitigated that way. Is that you don't worry about how they're making their materials. They can make them however they want, and then they're giving the materials to the lab, and then the lab is fully automated afterwards. So there's no worry in terms of potential mishaps within the lab beyond the robots messing things up on their own. But it is something that is at least in the framework of AIMD, we've been discussing this idea of how can we become a user facility where people can send their materials and then it takes its loop and it takes their decisions and they get access to their data. These are definitely challenging questions to address. So,
and definitely nasty chemistry on these autonomous labs is we're far away from being able to do that, at least in an academic setting.
But generally, I would say that there are classical risks of the labs that have to be ideally solved on the level of the engineering controls, then on the level of the software safeguards, which are hard-coded and so on. Realistically, the additional dangers associated with AI are vastly outgrown out of proportion. For the time being, we cannot do anything useful with AI. It's a little bit too premature to worry that AI goes and synthesizes something bad. So it doesn't obviate the classical lab risks, but the added value of AI on the decision level at this point is realistically minuscule. It may change in 3 years from now, but now it's not a concern.
So
Yeah,
Keo,
I can.
Oh, sorry, Corinne, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that from an industrial perspective, I can tell you the pains we have to go through just to take anything that is, out of sight of certain classes of chemicals into different labs or new labs, right? So that the point on engineering controls, there's a lot to be leaned on there in terms of kind of figuring these things out.
Right. Kyo, go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for all of your talks. That sounds like very exciting, like automation, like pipelines that are in the works. My question, it should apply to everyone, that in any automation, like automating process, my understanding is that a lot of the labor that the automation is sort of like helping with to alleviate that labor, like it is there's a lot of time saved, but then sometimes people who know some of the fine-tune process that are being automated, some of that knowledge of some of that fine-tune can fade away, and then when something goes wrong in the automation, it can be harder to solve like what is going wrong or bug fix. So I'm feeling curious, like how in each of your automation processes are you trying to sense if and when something is going wrong, and where do you find that human intervention to fix those things and know how things went wrong, both knowing the processes that are being automated and the automating and the apparatus to know how to correct the automation. Where is that coming up the most in each of your domains?
Yeah, I like the question, and very much so in terms of what are the skills that the humans need to retain, right, to be able to address these type of issues.
So in our analytical laboratory, we actually don't hear a lot of concerns about these kinds of things. Now, a lot of the analytical chemists or analysts have a much better understanding. They've taught themselves because of their own time savings to write Python and about a lot of these kinds of technologies, but they also work with very small sample sizes, right? Whether it's coming from manufacturing or the lab for some specific analysis, you're dealing with small quantities of material, and so these concerns just are smaller. The place where I hear this the most from our subject matter experts is really in our internal chemical scale-up organization. The folks who are going from 100 milliliters in a Maitreyo reactor to a 5-liter kind of flask in a hood to a ton reactor on a chemical processing plant, right? They get very nervous. Like, they're happy to have the kind of help to augment their workflows for themselves, but they are nervous that the next generation of experts working in that space won't have the same understanding that they do of these processes, because they didn't have to turn all the knobs in the same way, right? So in some ways it's very real, and there's a lot that you can't learn about the knob turning of any piece of equipment until you are doing it at large scale. At the same time, there's so much efficiency that the industry is likely going to go there. So we do our best to help these experts understand, and to understand what we may need to kind of flag or use as triggers as we're doing data analyses, right? What are the things they want to know, right? What would they do if the blip in the O2 monitoring happens here, right? So we try to use triggering as a first mechanism to help understand, does it assuage some of their concerns or not? It will never assuage all of their concerns, but at least it helps them understand which, and refocus their thoughts on which ones are critical and are detectable, right? And which ones are more challenging or more complex to identify.
So I liked your question a lot. It reminded me of discussions at universities related to utilization of LLMs in education. Is like, do you really need to know how to go through some of these through derivations by hand, or can you just utilize some of these equipment LLMs and plug it in and it will solve it for you? I think we still have to be able to teach the graduates how to interpret the outcomes, right, of these tools. They have to be able to use these tools, and they have to be able to interpret if they're right, if they're wrong, and how do they solve them. So there's no way that we can completely rely, in my opinion, on automation on its own. You really have to still continuously actively teach people involved in actually doing the knobs and turning the knobs and testing things out manually and making sure that what's happening in an autonomous framework is actually correct. And just as an example, even the laser shock setup that we have automated now in the lab, it was built separately outside of the lab in a separate lab, manually doing these tests and figuring out what the knobs are and how do they affect your outcomes. And then that was through communications, and I think David Elbert can even speak to that in terms of automating procedures and how they ultimately led to the procedures that lead to the right framework of setups that they're interested in. And so I don't think it's one or the other. I think you have to do both.
But the structure of the workforce changes. Instead of 50 people who have to learn some method, we need to have 10 who know on a really advanced level and 200 who can learn it on a very primitive one. So it's the same type of differentiation as was happening pretty much from the dawn of human civilization. So we just start to separate the role, and we have the ultra experts and people who become average, and then the world develops and ultra expert level becomes average level, and so on and so forth.
I totally understand and hear that there's going just that level, like you're saying, that it's from 50 to 10 having that expert knowledge. I think my question is not just like will the experts be necessary, but as we are automating, where do you find that expertise being most helpful for each of your specific domains? Like what yes, it's easy to just say you need to know everything, but is there something in particular as you are automating and as it's condensing from 50 to 10 that you're noticing those 10 people needing to know? Yeah.
I can actually give you an example from the automated microscopy. So when we started to work with it at Oak Ridge about 10 years ago, or even more, the idea was that the key challenge is to let the machine learning algorithm to talk to the instrument. So since the instruments have cost 5 mil and have a 150K service contract, you realize that anything that you do with instrument can lead to certain, shall we say, reputation losses for people involved. So it become easier. So now many manufacturers provide the APIs. In some other cases, you can work with the company and kind of sort of build your own API. So at Oak Ridge, it took us 4 years to build automated STEM and SPM. At University of Tennessee, our team did it in half a year. And the thing that we realized was that even if we have the fully automated dream tool, the question becomes what should it accomplish? So measuring things automatically on a grid is not machine learning. It's a kind of brute force solution, which basically means that if I want to build a useful automated experiment, I need to understand what is the value of the experiment for the downstream application. So I can build it only if, in some sense, that was kind of Amazon line of thinking, what's the value for the customer? So for me, as the microscopy, the customer is either the physicist or material scientist who uses the microscopy results in order to learn something about this sample. The instrument manufacturers cannot do that because they build the tools which are customer agnostic. They're good for everybody. So if I want to build a ML workflow, I need to understand what is the value of the experiment for the person who uses microscopy data, and only then I can make it in a meaningful manner, and only then I can benchmark it.
I think this is exactly right, and very interesting conversation. And by the way, this has happened in science multiple times, right? It's not automation. When I was a grad student, if you wanted to write a molecular dynamics paper, you would write your own molecular dynamics code. And a lot of people would argue that you couldn't write a paper, and then the second paper was a completely new piece of code. And people would argue that you wouldn't be able to do molecular dynamics if you didn't write your own code, right? And of course, that at DFT was the same thing, and of course that's not ludicrous today. And there's a lot of practitioners that are experts and very few people that develop the codes. And these folks develop Formula One codes, right? Not the type of codes that we would write in, in a physics lab as grad students. So this is all the time that we have for the panel. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for all the great questions. There's an interesting conversation going on the chat, but I told you I can listen and read at the same time, so I don't know the details. But there's the next in our schedule is poster award presentations, right, David?
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Ali.
And you can consider my concluding remarks to be done.
All right. Well, thank you, Ali, and thanks to everyone. And I think, Selena, you can correct me. I think Jonathan's ready to go with introductions of our poster winners, our exciting poster winners. Yes?
Excellent.
So yeah, I have the special pleasure to announce the winner of this year's poster prize. Each winner will receive a $500 prize and be able to present their poster again, and we will have the pleasure to hear more about their posters. But before that, I would like to thank the GatherTown organization team, Bhagawan Jaldai and Manav Sharma, for their hard work, both graduate students at Johns Hopkins University. And of course, Selena Fitzgerald, our communications specialist at MaRDA, and who has been helping us through the whole conference. And of course, we'd also like to acknowledge NIST and thank them for their funding for the poster session and our awards, and for prioritizing the development and the growth of the young MGI investigators. Okay, so getting to the poster prizes in the student category, and we have Maitreyo Biswas, graduate student at Purdue University, and this poster on unified graph-based deep learning approaches for perovskite structure optimization. So congratulations. Perfect, thank you. So congratulations again. We're excited to hear more about the poster again, as this also kind of my field. So please take it away.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the introduction. So I guess I'll move ahead and talk a little bit more about my poster. So already, like most of you must have seen the title. So this is like what we have been trying to put out is an unified graph-based neural network model for perovskite, especially halide perovskite structure optimization and property predictions. So over the years, so our group, like Professor Manodi's group, has created one of the biggest high throughput DFT libraries that comprises the novel halide perovskite alloys within this specific chemical space, and different possible native defects and impurities across the periodic table. And the most interesting part is we have data across different functionals as well that can be seen over here. And we have utilized subsets of this data set in multiple previous publications where we have predicted the decomposition energy, the formation energy, multi-fidelity predictions of band gap, including predictions at the experimental level, as well as predicting the defect formation energy and the charge transition levels and related properties. But like now we have this huge database. So now our goal is to put out an unified surrogate model that would help us to navigate this massive chemical space and not only give help in energy or property predictions, but also doing structural optimizations or reconstructions using the trained surrogate model. So we have considered this specific chemical space, which I talked about in the last slide as well. And to train this machine learning model, and especially to understand the potential energy surface, we have considered, as of now, only the GGAPB energies that includes the ground state structures as well as the intermediate structures. And our database can be classified majorly into three categories: the bulk data set that comprises unit cells as well as supercells, the defects data set that comprises neutral native defects and impurities across these supercells, and alongside these we also have some surface data that comprises different surface terminations, and a few native surface defects as well. And these three shows the violin plots for these three data sets and the total number of data points that we have. So next I'll move on to the model that we have trained. So what we have trained is the M3G net interatomic potential, or which is also referred as the MATGL interatomic potential. And this interatomic potential not only helps us to get the energy predictions, but also helps us to perform gradient-based structural relaxation solely based on this machine learning model. So the first model that I'll show is that I have trained on the defect plus bulk data that has been trained on approximately 9,700 structures. And we have done transfer learning on the pre-trained universal model that has been published previously. And this pre-trained universal model has been trained on the whole materials project database. Then we took this model and we freezed the base weights, and then we transfer learned specifically on our data. And as you can see, so these are the energy predictions from our model that shows the formation energy per atom. And these are the force predictions for our data set. So next, I'll show some case studies that we have performed using our trained model. So the first one is defect structure reconstruction using our interatomic potential. So just one example that I would show here is the cesium vacancy in cubic cesium lead bromide. So defects are pretty common in halide perovskites, especially like the cesium defect in cesium lead bromide. And it has been a well-known fact that if you perform DFT right onto the defect structure without any rattling or distortions, it often leads to being stuck in a local minima. So instead, what we do is we first relax the structure using the MATGL model. And as you can see, so this structure has been relaxed solely based on this MATGL model. And then we perform further DFT optimization on this structure. And here you can see from the initial DFT relaxation and the MATGL plus DFT relaxation that the second one leads to a lower energy structure as compared to the first one. And here I have shown a plot that shows the differences between the initial DFT and the MATGL plus DFT energies for all the possible neutral native defects in cubic cesium lead bromide. And as you can see that in most of the cases, the MATGL relaxation followed by a quick DFT relaxation leads to a lower energy structure, which might have been missed by the initial DFT. And next, I'll show the full volume relaxation using our MATGL model that has been done especially in this specific composition. So this is a pretty well-known and popular composition for halide perovskites, where it shows a photovoltaic efficiency of more than 25%, which is pretty great. And so we have considered this 3x3x3 supercell with 282 atoms, and we have considered the decomposition energy for it according to this formula. And our goal in this case study is to understand the effects of ordering. By ordering, what I mean is, so this is a project in collaboration with Professor David Fenning at UC San Diego. And we are together trying to study that instead of the disordered alloy that is supposed to be the lowest in energy, so we are trying to study that if specific rearrangements or like specific like orderings are more stable than the perfectly disordered random alloy that we simulate. So what we have done is we have used the quasi-random method to generate these alloys, and we have considered different orderings or like different possible disorderings in it. And the ordering numbers here specifically do not mean anything. It's just kind of the representation I wanted to show. But what this means that the rearrangement of these atoms within this supercell definitely leads to like either higher or lower energy structures.
So we'll have
So
to come to the conclusions because of the time also.
yeah, sure. So yeah, we have done the full DFT relaxation as well as the MaRDA relaxations, and we can see that both the relaxations are pretty close to each other, showing the success of our model. And this is just the summary that our model can predict all these properties as well as perform structure relaxations. And yeah, moving forward, we'll also integrate the surface data into our model. And I would love to acknowledge my advisor, Professor Manodi, my co-authors, and we acknowledge the funding resources from NSF and DOE as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Maitreyo. Definitely excited to read more. And then in our postdoc category, our winner is Wang, who is a research associate at Johns Hopkins University, and her poster is on HomoSeg instant segmentation with automated labeling and object tracking for crystallization kinetics of homopolymers in dilute phases. So the best kind of machine learning that allows us to do less boring work and more interesting science. Please take it away.
Thank you for offering the opportunity to talk a little bit about our work. It's really my privilege. So I'm a postdoc working with Vicky Wang and David Elbert. First, I'd like to acknowledge our collaborators, Paul Roberts, Anthony Kutola, Carmen Migler from NIST for providing us with the experimental data, and Professor Peter Olmsted from Georgetown University for his input. So the topic of our work is HomoSeg. Here, homo means homopolymer, and it refers to the problem we study, which is homopolymer crystallization kinetics. And seg means segmentation, and refers to the method we use, which is deep learning-based instant segmentation with object tracking. So this is an overview of our work. We have the experimental data, and we feed it into a deep learning model, and we extract the features from the data model and get some physical insights, such as the number size and the distribution of the crystals. So why should we care? It's because polymer blends makes up the highest fraction of plastic waste, but have the lowest rate of recycling. For pure polypropylene or polyethylene, after manufacturing, we have products without defect. But for a recycled polymer blends, since it's difficult to separate the polypropylene and polyethylene, after manufacturing, we have products with defect. Their microscale properties is related to this microscopic crystallization process, which is our problem of interest. And classically, this problem is studied manually in experiment. And what they did is that they pick a representative area from the original experimental data, and they manually count the number and measure the size of the crystals. So it's time-consuming, and the limited information can be accessed. And so we replace this tedious manual label with a few-shot learning data-driven model by a combination of deep learning-based instant segmentation and object tracking. So we use ULU for instant segmentation and deep sort for object tracking. So the other result we obtained with different method. So the first column is the original experimental data, and the second column is the result obtained with some conventional computer vision method, which can do only segmentation without classification. And so the third column is the result obtained using some deep learning model, which can do both the segmentation and classification. And the third column is the ground truth here for comparison. And so the last column is the result from segmentation with the tracking model. So besides segmentation and classification, we can also track the the size of the crystal across different frames. So we can further determine the number, the size, and the distribution of the crystals from the output of the data model. And then we can use this quantity to determine the nucleation rate and the rate of growth rate. And those are the input parameters of the Schneider rate equation and the Arami equations. So for future work, first we will integrate a stream processor with the current data-driven model and go from offline phase to online phase. And we will shift our focus from only polypropylene to the mixture of polypropylene and the polyethylene. So we will go from homopolymer to polymer blends. And we will also go from the single model to multimodal learning. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and congratulations again to both you and Maitreyo for winning the poster prizes. And yeah, also to all the other poster presenters yesterday. Again, I had a lot of very interesting posters and had some great discussions. And yeah, I think with that,
Thank you, Jonathan. I guess
we can back to you. Yeah,
yeah, I think it comes back to me. I think Ali told me that he has said his final piece, unless he wants to jump in. But I think that brings us to the end of the meeting, and that gives me the pleasurable task of thanking a lot of people that made it happen, but first really thanking the community. I know it's the third day and the numbers dwindle a little bit in who stayed, but we're really pleased you could stay to hear the poster presenters. I thought both are really interesting topics. Obviously, I'm involved in one, so I love that topic, but nonetheless, I really enjoy seeing the advance in the posters as I go around the posters each year to see how much further along we are, how many new techniques we're using, and how many new data sets are being gathered. I also really enjoyed today's sessions quite a bit to hear how working groups are working out. You know, this is something that we hope to increase our communication from MaRDA to you after the meeting and gather sort of all the ideas that have come out in our docs and see if we can keep the momentum and the enthusiasm, something we really need right now, I think, to keep these projects going and to launch some new working groups. You've already heard about Kate's really focused working group that's going to be an excellent approach to that. She's already got the lessons learned from the electron microscopy and LIMS working groups and a great methodology of organizing things, but we have lots of new things to do. And we have an awesome list now, if you didn't notice in the chat. So we've got to get a few people to say, hey, cool, let's get all those things on the list. But in the end, I really want to also go back and thank all the organizers of the different days and all the organizers of the sessions. I won't go back and read you the agenda one more time, but that's what really pulls the meeting together. And Selena, who has spent months working on trying to make this happen and integrating the various different pieces and tracking all of us down, especially me, of course, and trying to work out the communications. We get a little better at it every year, and we have some new challenges every year, and we write them in a folder, and next year we'll do better. We have been working towards having more in-person opportunities, and we're going to work on that, so you should keep an eye out for that. And I also want to thank Austin Tremblay, who has been in the background. We've only heard his voice come through, and he's managed everything so seamlessly with the Zooms and with the challenges to the Zoom. So we really appreciate the technical support as well. And with that,
I just want to jump in. I just want to jump in really fast and thank David. So thank you, David. You heroically pulled this off. There was a lot of uncertainty in the world writ large, and it was very difficult to pull this off in relatively short notice, and you really rallied the troops, and it was a great meeting. And thanks again also to all the other co-organizers who really helped. But thank you, David. You pulled us through.
You're very kind, and I
Thank you,
would
Kate, for saying that.
I would
was
be
hoping someone would
remiss if I didn't thank again our funding sources, which are both NIST and the NSF, have really stepped up to help keep MaRDA going. And you know, we really find that it makes a difference, obviously, not just in a bunch of us completely trying to run this on no shoestrings whatsoever. So we appreciate that and the long-term efforts. And with that, I think we've gotten back 12 minutes of our afternoon. So I think that's a great place to end the meeting. Thank you all once again. The content will end up on the website within a few days. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.